Welcome to this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Martina Clark. She's an author, an activist, an educator, and an occasional singer. Welcome to the show, Martina.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome to the show, Martina. You are welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people will benefit and understand more about your life, a courageous life with you. So that's why, it becomes you are the master for today. And it's a great privilege for me to be able to talk to you. So, Martina, I just want to, you are an occasional singer. What do you sing generally? Because is it about the beautiful life? Is it about the courageous life that you fought and made it for yourself? Is it about an unexpected life? Because long back, when you were 28, doctors told you that you have only 5 years to live because it was you had HIV at that point in time in 1996, if I understand.
92.
92, yeah. 96, you joined UNAIDS.
Yes. And 92 only matters because it's before we had treatment available. Yeah.
Right.
But I sing because I can't help myself. To answer that first question, I sing, and we currently are raising our grandson with us, and he's a singer. So we sometimes just sing things back and forth to each other, which is delightful. It's a lovely way to communicate.
Right. How do you look back when you look at 1992 and the doctor telling you about HIV, 28, you start just plan to live, just look at life. Now you have traveled the world, with the United Nations. How does it all look like? I want to understand if the doctor were true, you'd have missed all this so many years.
Yeah, I look back and I feel both exhausted because of all that has happened, but also incredibly grateful and often a lot astonished, very surprised, because these were not things that I thought I would be doing ever in my life, such as raising a grandson. Because, as you say, I was 28 years old. We didn't have treatment yet, and so the assumption was that I would be dead within a few years, 5 if I was lucky. And at that point, I sort of felt like I had nothing to lose, so I launched myself into being an activist because I felt like somebody had to stand up and say something, especially for women living with HIV, because our voices were not really heard as loudly as they could have been. And even today, they're not as loud as they could be in the fight against the AIDS pandemic. And so I became an activist, and it ended up affording me an extraordinary life, for which I'm very grateful, um, but definitely one that I would never have been able to anticipate because it sort of came out of nowhere. And hence the title of my book, My Unexpected Life. But it was it's been a great life in many ways. It's also been a very painful life because now I've been living with HIV for more than about 32 years. And along with that comes with losing so many friends who also have had HIV, and of course, people who have died from other things, COVID or other illnesses, accidents, murders, and so on. So it's a mixed bag. There are days when I feel I'm so lucky to be here, and then there are days when I feel like, this is the world we live in now. It's very disappointing because we fought really hard to be here, and we're still struggling for our rights, which is not how I thought things would go.
Right, Martina. When the doctor said about your having AIDS at 1992, how did you pick your life yourself? As you said, you went into activism, but obviously everyone wants to live, and I want to understand the motivation that prompted you to look towards life. Even look to, because at that point in time in 1992 there was no cure.
Mm.
So did you let yourself with the idea that okay, uh, it is the end of the road for you, or you wanted to fight not only the system but also the illness? I want to understand your mindset. Why? Because with time, lot of COVID has just, we're still during in that whole uh, pandemic thing. Officially it's not over. So I want to understand, with humanity going forward, a lot of new things will happen. A lot of things still do not have the cure. What is the mindset? What is the motivation? This is what, you were the uh, first openly HIV positive person hired to work for UNAIDS in 1996. That was later on. But I want to understand your mindset. What is it that you had at that point in time? Many did not. You were, if I use the right word, aging with HIV. I want to understand the mindset. What helped you? What is it that created strength for you? Because society was obviously there but still not there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely aging with HIV now. I can feel it in my knees this morning. But, in 1992, I was 28 years old, as you said at the beginning, and I should have been just starting my life out and maybe having a career and things like that, and instead, I was told I was not gonna live, and because we didn't have treatment, I really felt like I had nothing to lose, so I might as well become an activist because at least by being an activist and speaking out publicly, I believed that I might be able to maybe prevent somebody else becoming infected with HIV, or at least become a face to the statistic, if you will, of women with HIV, so that if another woman saw themselves, they wouldn't be feeling quite as alone. Because at the very beginning of my experience, I really felt I was the only woman with HIV because we were not very visible. And so it felt really important to start bringing up the issues of women with HIV, such as if you're going to have a research trial, you should provide childcare so women can be participants. Things like that that seem very basic when you say them out loud, but hadn't been quite integrated into the thinking of the people making all the decisions. And then my work with UNAIDS, again, it sort of fell from being involved with one organization, then to an international network of people with HIV, then to an international network of women living with HIV. And then I was on the board of directors of UNAIDS for about a year, and then they hired me to work for them. So there was a whole path that happened. All of it during that time, I was advocating for the needs of women and men and children with HIV. And then once I was working there, it was my job to sort of, well, my official job was to work with every NGO in the world that worked on HIV and AIDS, which there are about 7 gazillion. But my sort of unofficial job that I gave myself was to be the voice in the room at every single meeting I went to and say, are you considering the needs of people with HIV first and foremost? And if not, how do we make sure that that stays our focus? And the people at UNAIDS were wonderful, brilliant, motivated, really kind, good people. But a lot of them had been working in their field for a long time, and they didn't always think about what is the user's need of this service we're providing. And so I sort of took it upon myself to be that voice of reason, that we're here to serve people living with HIV, to help governments support their populations, and hopefully to avoid more people becoming infected. How are we going to keep that our focus and not just talk about the budgets and the bottom line and the organizational structure of things, which doesn't always, it's not that it doesn't help, but it delays the process, we'll say. So I was sort of an activist in-house at UNAIDS, and I feel proud of that work.
Right, Martina. Let us go to 1992. We'll understand that world a bit more, because that world, the difficult world, is still inside so many of us humans. It just comes out whenever things are a bit dark. 1992, was a different era altogether. The Iron Curtain had fallen down. Germany had reunited, but HIV created a different wall of sorts. In the USSR also, there was this big change that had happened around that time, but HIV created a very different sort of a wall. You fought, you became a part of UNAIDS. At that point in time, several movies were also made around this subject. Men were facing their own problems. But for a woman, what was it like, facing, okay, the doctor said it, that activism was going on, but what was it like living in the society and trying to deal with that, deal with not only the health issue, because at that point in time that was not, there was no cure, and as well as looking at the society itself. How did you look at, because the UNAIDS thing came only later on.
Yeah. So it's true there was no cure, and in fact there still is no cure. There's treatment which makes it a manageable disease, but it's still not a cure. But at that point, very personally, I just assumed that that was the end of my life. I had a few years, I should do as much as I could. Um, so I didn't really even think about a cure. I hoped there would be one, but I didn't think about it on a daily basis. I just sort of kept going. And then, of course, I still had to work because I had to feed myself and have a home to live in. So a lot of basic day-to-day things didn't really shift. But what changed was what I worked on. My work that I had been doing sort of as my primary work became my secondary work, often to fund the activism, which was not paid. And the things that we were really fighting for, besides, like I said, issues for women to have childcare if they needed to come to treatment or be in a research process or something, research trial. But also the stigma of HIV was so strong, and it is still there. It has never quite gone away. And having gone through COVID, I've seen the dramatic difference that, yes, there was also some stigma attached to COVID, but not at all in the same way as with HIV. Um, that was a huge thing, and I think the biggest reason that we have all of that stigma is because it's related to sex. Most people in the world get HIV through unprotected sex, and most people in the world at some point in their life have unprotected sex. That's how we have more babies in the world. It's just part of a normal life. And so people are afraid of that because they realize it's something that could happen to them. And so they put up a wall, and that turns into stigma and discrimination because they don't want to feel in any way that they identify with people with HIV, because that means they could become one of them. So one of the biggest things that we fought was the stigma and just the constant education. We had to re-educate people constantly, educate new people, educate younger people, educate older people, parents, single people, teenagers, everybody you can imagine, to get them to understand that uh, the battle was against the virus and should not be against the people living with HIV. And I think that's what we really stood up for. Um, and for me, in, again, an unexpected way, it gave me a sense of purpose that I think kept me healthier because I had a drive in me to fight something instead of getting mad at myself or getting mad at a certain person or something, or mad at the virus, because I was not productive. Understandable, but not productive. And so becoming an activist gave me a way to make sense of having HIV and to truly believe that if I could make a difference for one other person, then my activism would be worth it. And so I kept doing that, and it kept serving me well. And I actually didn't need treatment until 2008, which was almost 17 years later, which was really, really unexpected. Excuse me. Which was really unexpected because usually people need to start treatment within a few years. But I was a long-term non-progressor. But in those years, I kept doing all of the activism. And then only later did I eventually leave the UN because I was sort of burnt out on that. And I became an educator in college level, teaching English and public speaking and things like that. But I was fighting for for us to be heard. I think if I can say, like, narrow down to one thing, it was fighting for our right to be heard and to speak for ourselves, not to always have other people speaking for us. I think that was the main little teeny tiny piece that I worked on.
Right, right, Martina. Uh, Initially, you thought that you would be there as per the doctor what they say he or she said. When was that time when you felt that you are there for the long haul and that you will complete this fight and that you will live life on your own terms? 2008 or before? Much before that, you must be getting that feeling.
That's a great question. I would say at 5 years, after the doctor had said I probably had good 5 years to live, when the 5 years came and went, I was like, hmm, I'm still here. I'm still healthy. And then I think at 10 years is probably when I said, okay, nobody knows. And now at 10 years in 1992, would have been 2002, at that point, we had treatment. So I knew that if I got sick, I would be able to start treatment, which is something I did not have in 1992. So those 10 years later, I had a completely different perspective. And I feel like then I started to feel like, okay, I'm in this for the long haul. I'm going to be here. I better start planning for my future. Uh, I should, make sure that I start saving a little bit of money and maybe do something that will take care of me in my old age. Um, and of course, we still don't know that the treatment will work for everybody forever, but we at least have some options now that we did not have. But I'd say a good about 10 years in. That's a great question.
Right. The Almighty gave you a chance to work from within the system. How would you describe that system? What was the challenge? Is what within the system as well as outside the system? And what changes do you think with your activism, with your efforts, while fighting your own uh, illness at that point in time? How would you look that at that part? And when you look at things today in terms of HIV, with some whatever progress that the numbers have gone down, if I understand, correct me if I'm wrong. How do you look at it today? Because still, if I understand, you need to get the HIV test done if at all you are going as a patient for any blood test or whatever it is. Help us understand the state of HIV today, and how do you look back the way you impacted uh, this particular in the fight against HIV/AIDS from the UN for across the world.
Yeah. So just quickly, I would say that today things are much better, to be sure, but people are still getting infected at rates that are higher than they should be because not enough people either have access to adequate healthcare or are getting the messages that they need. Often in countries where there's conflict going on, that disrupts the whole healthcare system. And that's many countries in Central Africa, for example, and all over the world. As we know, we can all see the news. There's war everywhere. Um, so the numbers are better than they were, and definitely people who have access to healthcare and treatment, they have a much better life expectancy. So that's the major shift. People are still getting infected, but people are living longer with HIV. So that's a great thing. Um, in terms of fighting from within the United Nations, to me, the biggest challenge was the bureaucracy. The people I worked with, certainly individual by individual, they were wonderful, and they all had the same goals that I did, was to try and stop this pandemic and mitigate the damage. But getting things done in the United Nations is very challenging. And I often tell people that when you think about a company, if you have a board of directors, you maybe have 5 or 6 people on your board of directors, and they do all of the big decision making on how the company is going to work. The United Nations has 193 board members, if you will, because they have 193 countries. So there are so many people trying to decide what should happen that it's really hard to actually get anything done. And so you can have the best ideas, but getting those ideas put into place takes a very long time to get it through all of the layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy. Um, but I will say that after I left UNAIDS, a couple years later, I went and I joined UNICEF. And my job there was to roll out a global HIV in the workplace program for UNICEF. And that basically means that the UNICEF management decided that we had to educate our own staff about HIV because we're telling the rest of the world what to do. We needed to do it ourselves. And it was clear that we had personnel living with HIV who were not getting the care that they needed because they didn't feel safe to talk about it in the office. So I started that work. And then about the same time, a few other agencies and groups were doing the same thing in the UN. And we joined together and we created a program called UN Cares, which was a UN system-wide HIV in the workplace program for all UN personnel in every country and their dependents and loved ones. It was a huge undertaking, but we managed to conceive of the idea, to design the program, and get approval to run the program, and a little bit of money to make it happen. And that also, just as a side note, that was a really challenging part for our work because the UN gets money from donor countries to serve people in need, not to take care of the staff. So for us to take care of our own personnel, we had to get our own money. So that was another challenge. But ultimately, that program was up and running and is still functioning in about 120 countries. And that made a huge difference because then we not only brought the issue into the room, we made it sort of management mandated that you have to talk about it for at least a few hours, once every couple months or once a year, depending on where they were. And it allowed people to express their fears and ask the questions because they were forced to do it. And a lot of people didn't want to do it. But as soon as we turned it around to the idea that they were learning information they could use to save their children, because maybe their kids would go to school in another country and they would need to make sure they had that information. As soon as you sort of shifted the focus, everybody's like, oh yeah, I do have questions. And people were much more receptive. And we trained tens of thousands of people. And ultimately that impacted our programming work as well, because we were able to deliver better programming because more staff understood what HIV is. Excuse me. Yeah. So I think the
Right.
bureaucracy was the biggest battle, but we did it. It just took a lot of time.
Absolutely. And talking of bureaucracy, one thing I find very ironical, Martina, is that, you know, that if it is an issue about a political matter, every country will ask questions or have questions. How on earth does bureaucracy come in a matter like HIV, which is so serious? It is about people. I don't think as it was a political matter at all. Why did it have to come in at all? Because the
I think
world, this was raging like a wildfire at that point in time. And it's like needing immediate humanitarian aid. It is what United Nations is all about. Means as an
absolutely.
individual sitting in another part of the world, I find it very, very ironical and almost shocking. People look at people in power as, as someone who will give them that that uh, that answer as soon as possible. Help us understand this. Has it changed, or does this still continue to happen?
You're absolutely right, Ajay. I think it has not changed enough. It's a little bit better. Um, but again, I think that the reason it did not get the immediate attention and the full support that it deserved, which could have changed completely the trajectory of the pandemic. Many people could have been spared. was again because it relates to sex. And there was a perception that it was bad people who had sex who got HIV only, when it's just people who have HIV, right? There should not be a judgment, but there was a judgment. And so even countries as governments sort of distanced themselves that, oh, that's not our issue because we only have good, perfect people in our country. So we don't want to think about it. When in reality, it's a virus. The virus is everywhere. Every single country on the planet, it exists. But people had a difficult time just to talk about it because it was scary to them. And I think they just couldn't take it seriously because they didn't want to risk the possibility that somebody might think, oh, it could be you, it could be me. And so they shut down. Eventually, I think every country now has sort of come on board to deal with this. But it took so long, and we could have been joining forces so much earlier to to change things and to increase the access to public health for everybody, because that's one of the main things. If you don't have access to public healthcare, you can't treat any disease, right? If you don't have clean water to take your medicine, if you have to walk to the river because you live in a place where there's a drought to get the water, but somebody in your house has diarrhea, so you have to go 5 or 6 times a day, then the girl child gets taken out of school to do that work while the other women in the family take care of the sick people. Things like that, it all plays into the life cycle of caring for somebody with HIV. And if we could get all of the other systems in better place, we could avoid so much of this. And we saw the same thing repeating with Ebola, with COVID. Um, so we're still not there. For some reason, it's easier to get up and scream and yell when it's a clear-cut war. You could take a side, right? When it's a virus, it's hard to sort of fight that little virus because it's not standing up saying anything. It's just going around killing people. And so people um, don't seem to have the capacity as much to stand up and fight for the people who are falling ill because of a virus. And I don't understand that either, to be completely honest, but I really think it gets back to when it comes to health, we feel vulnerable and it's scary and it can be completely overwhelming. And as you said, HIV spread like wildfire. It happened so fast, although not nearly as fast as COVID. But again, at least in my country, in the United States, where I live now, we did not respond well. We had a terrible, terrible response because there was sort of an arrogance and an ignorance that this wasn't really our problem. And I currently live in New York City, and we had refrigerated trucks, serving as morgues because there were so many people, we couldn't bury them fast enough. Um, and that was not because the individual healthcare workers didn't want to do it. It was because the higher ups in government put their head in the sand. And I think that's what happened with the HIV pandemic as well.
Absolutely, I understand. But the fact of I've stayed behind, close to a village, I've walked on sand for many years. One thing I can tell you, if you put your head in the sand, someday the sand will become too hot for you. Then you will know exactly. So people who are in that position of power, that position is given by God Himself. And if you don't understand it, perhaps someday you will understand when you will be all alone with your conscience. That's for them to decide, be that as it may. One thing I want to understand from you, Martina, is that HIV virus is still there after so many years.
Hmm.
COVID, novel coronavirus, we had a vaccine in just 1 year. Why not something like that for HIV in so many years? Is it good business for a lot of people?
So I think there's a couple of answers to that. One, I will just sort of take a short side trip to the fact part of the reason we had the COVID vaccines was because of the years and decades of work trying to find a vaccine for HIV. So science had done a lot of the research that allowed them to say, oh, that's this kind of virus. We know this works. Didn't work for HIV, but it might work here. And they did the testing very quickly and were able to roll it out to people. And it made a huge difference. So on one hand, HIV helped COVID not be worse. Um, but I think my honest personal opinion, not representing anybody else, is that big pharma, the pharmaceutical companies, make a lot of money off of all of the medication. And again, just like the idea in our country, in the United States, we don't have universal health care. And people cannot seem to grasp the concept that if you keep everybody healthy, if everybody has access to a doctor when they need one, people will live longer and they won't cost as much money. It's the same thing with the vaccines. If we had a vaccine and people just don't get HIV in the first place, their lives are better, it costs a lot less, everybody's safer. But the pharmaceutical companies make a lot of money off of selling the treatments. And the treatment I take, for example, costs, I think, about $4,000 a month US.
That's
That's
a lot of money. That's a lot of money.
that's a lot of money. And that's in 2023. It's not like it just came out and they, needed to charge that much to recoup their research costs. This is a long time it's been available and it still costs this much money. But that's just for one pill every day. Um, so that's an obscene amount of money. And I have to be on a program that subsidizes my treatment or I don't get treatment. And it makes it you know, um, an implausible decision to sort of, nobody can make that choice. Do I live or do I take the treatment? And, it's just should not be this hard, basically. And I don't know why the treatments cost that much money, but for whatever the reason they do, they're making a huge amount of money off of every patient. And I sort of feel like, I hate to say that because I don't want people to be cast in a bad light, but I do kind of feel like they are earning too much money to reinvest their funds into research to prevent it. It's more beneficial, more cost efficient to, not cost efficient, it's more beneficial to them, to their profits, more profit making to keep people on treatment for decades. So I think that is part of the problem. The greed of the pharmaceutical companies and all of the companies around it that sort of support this. People come second after profits, and it should be the other way around. It should be people before profits, in my opinion.
How do you see the future for the fight against HIV? And how have you planned your life now? Now that you have planned and lived, and I'm sure you'll be there is a long way for you to still go. You have just written your first book, in 2021, if I understand. So, help us understand about perspective. How do you plan it, and why did you take so long to write this book?
So it took me so long to write the book, partly because I was working full time for so many years for the United Nations. It was really when I stopped working at UNICEF that I worked more seriously on the book. It took me a long time because I always felt I had been a writer, but I didn't really have all of the skills to put together a whole book. I mean, writing an essay is one thing, writing a 300-page book is another thing. So it's partly time. And then it took a long time to find a publisher because that's just sort of how the world works. If you're not a glamorous movie star or something, it takes a long time to find a publisher. In terms of the future of activism, I think that it's I don't know if there will ever not be a time when we need activists to fight for HIV, because with each new generation, there's a whole new group of people that need to be trained. I think kids today don't really know much about it, so they need to learn, and so on and so forth. And also it becomes sort of, it's in the background. People don't really think about it as much because there's other things that are more compelling at the moment. So it's sort of battling for screen time, if you will, or headline time, to keep it on people's agenda. So I think there will always be a role for activists, and it just shifts a little bit by who is most impacted by the pandemic at any given point, because that has shifted also a little bit with time. Um, and personally, I hope to start doing more writing. I'm sort of phasing back from teaching at the college level, and I hope to focus more on writing and my creative things, and just maybe slow down because I'm exhausted. It's been really, as I have said so many times, it's been wonderful and a blessing to be here. It's also been exhausting to be fighting the fight as an activist, fighting the world who doesn't want to hear about it, and also fighting my body. And now I also had COVID early on, and I'm still dealing with COVID long-term symptoms 3.5 years later. And COVID has actually done more damage in a short period of time than HIV has in 30 years. So it's just, there's a lot. I just want to slow down and maybe do more writing and more art. That's what I want to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You need all the rest. That is, everyone needs a bit of
Yeah,
time for
everyone
themselves.
does, obviously.
Individual
Yep.
time. Absolutely. Very quickly, I know it can be very exhausting to remember all those things also early in the day. One last question I want to understand from you, Martina, is the book. What
hmm
is it that you want to convey through that book? To for whom is this book for? And just want to understand what this book is all about. What can people take away from that book?
Sure. So the book is it's a braided memoir, we say, because it has sort of a couple of different storylines. And one is my life with HIV as a woman with HIV. I don't think that we have enough stories of women with HIV, so a reader will get to know what that's like versus what it would be like for a man. It's the story also of my work with the United Nations. So it's a chance for the reader to get a sort of an inside glimpse of what it's like to work in the United Nations. The squishy underbelly of the beast is what I call it. And then it's also a lot of travel. So for somebody who likes travel writing, I have a lot of parts where I go and I do work in different countries. And so you get a little bit of that. And I think for me, what I really hope people take away from it is that one person can make a difference. And if we just sit back and wait for somebody else to do it, things might not change ever. But if we step up and we take some initiative, then likely we'll meet a few other people and then we can join hands, and then collectively we can actually change things and make the world more like the one we want to live in. So that's what I really hope people get from it. Yeah. And it's a little bit funny in some places.
Absolutely, absolutely. You need a bit, lot, not only a bit, a lot of humor to live this life courageously,
Absolutely.
and especially if it is an unexpected life. Well,
Yeah.
Martina, a lot of people who want this book, to want to get this book for them. So, what's the best way for them to, and also, if possible, if they get to learn more, understand more about you, connect with you, if possible, how is that?
The easiest thing is I have a website, which is martina-clark.com. Um, and I think you probably, if you Google martinaclark.com, it will come up pretty quickly. And there you'll find links to places where you can buy the book. It's also an audiobook, which I narrated. And there's also some other essays and other podcasts, interviews that I've done. So there are other ways. And then you can directly contact me and send me a message if you want. And I'm on all the socials, but that would take forever to list them. But I'm mostly on uh, LinkedIn, surprisingly, and Instagram. I've given up on Twitter. It's gone in a dark place, so I'm not there anymore. So my website is the easiest, martina-clark.com.
Absolutely, Martina. Absolutely. From an unexpected life, you made it with your fight with you made it a beautiful life for, I'm sure, a lot and lot of people who perhaps never were able to tell you thank you, but in their silence, I'm sure they must be thanking people like you who have fought, who helped them fight this disease, and still to this day. you know,
Thank you.
and for your resilience and the courage to continue to, live courageously, live meaningfully, and live beautifully. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.